400 miles south of Newfoundland, a 1 million-ton chunk of Greenland ice drifts into the North Atlantic shipping lanes. After a journey of more than 1,900 miles, it is about to become the most notorious iceberg in history.
Everyone knows that the Titanic hit an iceberg and sank.
The Titanic's story is as iconic as the ship herself. She was the largest and most luxurious liner of her era, and supposedly unsinkable. But a giant iceberg is only part of Titanic's story.
If anyone tells you that they found the one reason Titanic sank, then they haven't read enough.
The bow section of the ship couldn't properly fit into the yard that the ship was being built in, and that's the reason they decided to go for hand rivets.
Because the second officer had been changed over before the sinking, they didn't actually have a key for the binoculars.
A number of passengers opened their portholes to see if they could see what was going on.
A tragedy on the scale of the Titanic disaster was caused by hundreds of little events, but there are about 10 that are the key events.
All of these things combined led to the inevitable fact that the Titanic would hit the iceberg and sink.
10 mistakes. On their own, each of these was survivable, but they piled one on top of the other to cause a catastrophe. September 1911. Titanic was completing her construction at the Harland & Wolff shipyard in Belfast. She was the second of 3 identical ships, Olympic, Titanic and Britannic, commissioned by the White Star Line Shipping Company and designed to wow the world.
It sounds a cliche, but she really was beautiful.
The Titanic was the largest passenger ship in the world at the time of her introduction into service.
882 feet long, which made her the longest ship afloat.
In fact, she was the largest moving object made by man at the time.
If you stood her on the end, she's nearly as tall as the Empire State Building, and yet she's only as wide as 1/3 of a football field. So she's very long, she's very sleek, she's very graceful on the outside. On the inside, she is opulent beyond belief. They wanted to create the most comfortable Atlantic crossing you could possibly imagine.
Alongside all that luxury, Titanic boasted the latest safety features. More lifeboats than any other ship afloat. The brand new technology of radio. And watertight bulkheads designed to stop the ship from sinking. The effectiveness of these bulkheads was about to be tested in real life, in an incident that would trigger the first great mistake in Titanic's story. On the 20th of September 1911, Titanic's sister ship, the Olympic, was steaming down the Solent in the English Channel.
The Olympic is about to set off for her 5th voyage across the Atlantic, and she's sailing through the Solent parallel to a Navy warship called HMS Hawke.
And they were having a bit of a race, so there was a bit of fun going on between the two ships.
Due to the restricted channel, the Olympic tried to maneuver out of the way of the Hawke, but it was misjudged.
The Olympic effectively cuts up the Hawke, and he couldn't stop a collision. Unfortunately, HMS Hawke was designed to spike other ships.
Her hull was built as a battering ram, so this huge ram actually went straight into the side of Olympic.
It's cracked plates, it's popped rivets.
There were very few ships in 1912 that could have survived such a disaster.
But the fact is, Olympic's bulkheads had contained the flooding.
The Olympic, like the Titanic, featured a series of internal bulkheads dividing the ship into watertight compartments. Even though the warship had punched a hole in her side, the bulkhead compartments prevented water from flooding the whole ship, allowing her to stay afloat.
I think the spectacular survival of the Olympic from the Hawke collision planted a dangerous idea in people's minds.
If a warship can take you on and you can just sail home again and get fixed, then it's giving people the wrong idea.
Many would have thought, well, that really does make the ship relatively unsinkable.
And that attitude wasn't just confined to the uninitiated.
The captain of the Olympic at the time of her collision with Hawke is Edward Smith, and he will be Titanic's captain on her maiden voyage. So to his mind, he's had a practical demonstration of how one of these Olympic-class ships can be severely damaged and yet not sink. And this helps build this public perception that Titanic is unsinkable when she sails.
Not only did the crash lull White Star into a state of dangerous complacency, it had another serious consequence for the Titanic.
Following Olympic's collision, she had to be rushed to Belfast for repairs.
For White Star, it was a matter of urgency to get Olympic back up and running as soon as possible.
Don't forget, she's already got bookings to ferry people across the Atlantic. So in terms of your priorities, if you're White Star Line, you're losing revenue. So you set Titanic aside and you fix Olympic before you go back to finishing Titanic.
Prioritizing the repairs to Olympic halted Titanic's construction and delayed her maiden voyage by 3 weeks.
The delay of a month into service put Titanic's entry into commission in April, right at the beginning of the ice period on the North Atlantic.
A season which is notorious for icebergs.
If that wasn't bad enough, freak weather meant that spring 1912 would see more icebergs than usual on the shipping routes.
Usually in any April, you'd expect sight of about 125 of them. That year, there were over 400.
It's about the worst that they've seen for 50 years.
More than 3 times the seasonal average of icebergs was drifting into the Atlantic shipping lanes, pushed south by a particularly unusual set of weather conditions.
There were a number of factors that brought the ice across the shipping lanes in April 1912. One of them was a warm winter in 1911, and this had created a huge amount of freezing meltwater. There was so much ice in the Labrador Current in April 1912 that instead of the bergs melting away as soon as they hit the Gulf Stream, this actual flood water, this freezing river, flowed very far south into the Atlantic.
But the iceberg that would be Titanic's nemesis was on a circuitous journey.
The iceberg doesn't drift straight into the Atlantic. It follows the currents, it travels north for a little while, and it's journeying around for about 6 months until eventually it drifts into the shipping lanes just south of Newfoundland in Canada.
10th of April 1912. The RMS Titanic pulled out of Southampton Harbour with 2,224 passengers and crew and set out on a 7-day maiden voyage for New York.
Titanic was planning to be at Pier 59 in New York on the 17th of April. Now, in fact, given the distance from Europe to New York, she only had to maintain an average of 18 knots.
But when she hit the iceberg, she was going much faster than that.
The simple fact is she was going too fast. 22 knots in an ice field. Had she been going slower, she may have missed the berg. Everything else would have been academic.
This excessive speed is the second major mistake that caught out the Titanic, and perhaps the most avoidable, because the Titanic's captain, Edward Smith, had a reputation for speed.
Captain Smith was the White Star Line's best captain. He was known as the millionaire's captain, and that's because people loved traveling with him.
Not only is he a competent captain and a captain that you would trust with your big shiny new ship, but more importantly, he has the patter.
He was urbane, he was sophisticated, he looked the part.
The millionaires and the first-class passengers, they love him. He's very good at schmoozing.
After all, being the master of one of these big ships is really being in charge of a big group of passengers, socialising with them.
People would book on to a ship to sail with Captain Smith, so nobody else was going to get the job.
He really liked going fast as well. He liked to get his passengers there as fast as possible. And let's face it, these passengers wanted to get there on time, and they knew that come hell or high water, Smith would get them there.
White Star Line pitched themselves as the reliable option. If they say that they will get you to New York on Wednesday, then you will be there on Wednesday, come what may.
Captain Smith knew that speed was key if Titanic was going to make it to New York in good time.
What we know from Smith's logbook is he was gradually going faster and faster. As the engines of these new liners settled down, he was putting on more speed.
So Smith would usually average a speed of around 21 knots, 2 or 3 knots faster than the minimum required.
Invariably, most captains operating on a transatlantic voyage will want to go as fast as possible in the early part of the voyage to have something in hand in case they encounter fog. Fog is very prevalent on the North Atlantic, and it generally means you have to slow down. So by going faster at the beginning, you have something in hand just in case you meet the unexpected fog.
This was quite the norm in 1912. Skippers tended not to slow down until they had visibility problems. They always felt if they could see far enough ahead to turn or to stop. Icebergs were a navigational hazard which you had to take into account, but it was more usual for ships to arrive late than hit icebergs.
Smith would not have been unduly worried by the iceberg risk. 7 months earlier, he'd been captain of the Olympic when she survived a serious collision.
If you are Smith and you have captained Olympic and she's survived being rammed by a scary-looking spike on the front of a Royal Naval vessel, then you are not going to be that concerned about what a little iceberg might do to you. Because in your mind, if there's a big iceberg, your people are going to see it and steer away from it.
No doubt the perceived risk of striking an iceberg was so small that it was discounted. But there was the very real risk. If the ship arrived late in New York, there would be a lot of adverse publicity.
But on this particular voyage, the captain had something else to worry about, smouldering in the decks below. Something that the company had expressly concealed from its passengers.
It is now quite well known that Titanic was in fact on fire when she left Southampton on her maiden voyage. In 1912, ships were powered by steam and the boilers were powered by coal, and Titanic used 600 tons of coal a day, which was shoveled into the boilers by a team of firemen.
The whole idea is the coal would power the ship from one side of the Atlantic to the other. Sometimes in some of the bunkers you could get combustion of a piece of coal, which would result in a bunker fire.
When you have a pile of coal stored in a bunker, oxygen or water can get in and start reacting with the coal. The ingredients for a fire are oxygen, which we've got, a heat source, which we have, again here, and fuel, which is our coal. So all the ingredients are there, and as more of this coal combusts, the heat goes up in that room, and therefore more coal will catch fire, and it's almost like a chain reaction.
When they gave evidence to the inquiry into the sinking, Titanic's firemen revealed that a fire had taken hold in the coal bunker in Boiler Room 5.
The fire had been going since Belfast, when Titanic would have sailed with a skeleton crew round to Southampton to make the voyage.
So when the Titanic left Southampton, the fire was already there.
The 3-story high bunker was only finally emptied on Saturday the 13th of April, 1 day before the collision.
Fire was burning for something in the region of about 10 days. It took that long to actually empty the bunker.
Taking 10 days to put out such a serious fire was bound to have consequences.
When you think about it, it's quite obvious that days and days of fire heat on something is going to have an effect on the bunker.
Burning at between 500 and 1,000 degrees Celsius, the fire would have made the steel walls of the bunker red hot.
If you imagine a sheet of metal, which the Titanic was made of, if you imagine that is made up of individual building blocks, imagine those building blocks are attached together with glue. That glue is going to get warmer and it's going to make that sheet of metal more bendy. So that's what happens when it heats up. They're not really designed to withstand that kind of heat, and it could have been much hotter than 500 degrees in there.
The sheet of steel that formed the bunker's rear wall did another critical job. It was part of a watertight bulkhead, the safety feature specifically designed to stop the ship from flooding if she got a hole in the hull.
We know for a fact that the heat caused by the fire did affect the bulkhead between boiler room 6 and 5.
What two of the surviving firemen actually said was that once the coal was taken out of bunker number 5, that you could see how the bunker had warped because of the continued heat it had been exposed to.
Barrett described it as being dinged in on one side and out on the other side.
So the warping of the steel plates may have weakened one of Titanic's vital watertight bulkheads.
We know from the inquiry into the Titanic disaster that the intense heat of the bunker fire on the Titanic had actually deflected the metal of the hull. And this meant that there was no longer a perfect seal, and in fact the fire-damaged plates in the bulkhead may have been weeping about 1 or 2 buckets of water per hour, even before the collision.
So there was a degree of the bulkhead being compromised. To what degree, no one's really sure. But the mere fact that it was dinged at all suggests that there was something wrong.
Under normal conditions, this warping would have had very little effect on the safety of the ship.
It's an inconvenience of the job. It's something they would have dealt with before successfully. They wouldn't have been obsessing about the integrity of the ship because of the bunker fire.
It would take something really extraordinary to exploit any weakness caused by the fire. 11th of April 1912. In the freezing waters of the North Atlantic, massive icebergs have drifted south into the transatlantic shipping lanes.
Bergs come in all sorts of different shapes and sizes. Some of them were just things called growlers, which is really just huge lumps of ice floating near the surface. The berg the Titanic actually crashed into was larger than this 5-story engine behind me.
The luxurious RMS Titanic is a day into her maiden voyage, her 1,317 passengers enjoying the finest White Star has to offer. But as she steamed towards New York at a brisk 22 knots, the gigantic iceberg was drifting slowly south. And this was one iceberg no captain wanted to meet.
She has more than 1 million tons of ice, and most of it is below the surface. And there's a huge jagged edge of it just waiting to snag you as you go past.
By 1912, ships weren't sailing entirely in the dark. Most transatlantic passenger liners had cutting-edge wireless radio invented by Marconi and were expected to alert each other to the location of dangerous bergs.
Early 20th century, Marconi and wireless was actually quite new. Basically, the telegraphists were trained in what they call Morse code, dit-dit-da-da. The whole idea was that they would signal using a key to a ship which could be, in the case of the Titanic, several hundred miles away, depending on how big and how high your antenna was.
But on the night of Sunday the 14th, the wireless operators in Titanic's Marconi room were about to make a mistake because they weren't worrying about ice warnings. They had other priorities.
In 1912, radio was a novelty. The radio operators were employed by the Marconi Company and not the White Star Line. And what they were interested in doing is getting paid to send messages from passengers to the shore.
It's the equivalent of having Wi-Fi now. It was something for passengers to communicate.
About stocks and shares, or what time people would meet other people.
Hello, boy. Dining with you tonight in spirit. Heart with you always. Best love, girl.
No sickness? All well. Notify all interested in poker. Sending you this from the middle of the Atlantic.
The wireless operators, they are there as a commercial entity to send passenger traffic. So there's a conflict of interest between what they prioritise and how urgently certain messages are dealt with.
As well as incoming passenger messages, the operators received urgent safety alerts from nearby shipping. They were marked with 3 letters to highlight their importance.
MSG, Master Servicegram, was a priority message that was intended to be sent to the captain, and it was used for things such as ice warnings and the like.
If they have the MSG prefix, you make sure that the captain gets it.
Several ice warnings from other ships earlier that day were marked MSG and were duly relayed to Captain Smith.
Captain Smith saw and received all these messages, so he decided to go a little bit further on, about half an hour additional travel before turning west towards New York. Heading a little bit further south, just to sort of give himself a little bit more leeway to what he thought lay ahead.
At 5:50 p.m., the ship changed course. Soon afterwards, Captain Smith quit the bridge to go to dinner, unaware of what the change of course would mean. While Smith entertained first-class passengers to a 10-course dinner featuring oysters and filet mignon, in the Marconi room, the messages were piling up.
Saturday night, Sunday morning on the Titanic had been very, very difficult for the 2 telegraphists. They had a major failure of the equipment. In fact, they spent about 6 or 7 hours trying to repair it. As a result, during this time, a very, very large backlog of communications had built up.
At 9:52 p.m., another ice warning arrived. This one from the SS Mesaba, a few hours ahead of the Titanic, heading for New York on almost exactly the same course.
So much heavy pack ice and a great number of large icebergs. Also, field ice.
It was a clear warning that Titanic's new route would take her straight into an ice field bristling with giant bergs. But the message never reached Captain Smith.
The problem with the Mesaba message is that there was no MSG prefix. Now, Jack Phillips was not a navigator, so when the Mesaba message came in, all he saw was numbers there. It would have meant nothing to him.
Had the letters MSG been on that message when it was received by Jack Phillips, then that message he would have known to prioritise it and send it to the bridge. As it was, it didn't have them, so he set the message aside for later and carried on with his passenger traffic.
Almost an hour later, Titanic received an even starker warning from a ship just 10 miles away. But again, the 3 critical letters, MSG, were missing.
At 10:30 p.m. on the night the Titanic sank, so only an hour before the collision, a vital message came in from the nearby Californian, who radioed the Titanic to say that they were stopped and surrounded by ice. Now, unfortunately, right at the moment that it arrived, the wireless operators on the Titanic were really busy doing what's called working Cape race.
Titanic was trying to communicate with Newfoundland over 400 miles away, so it would have had its radio set switched on to a very high level. The Californian, fairly close to the Titanic, when it sent out the message to the ship, it would have come through extremely loud.
It nearly blasted their ears off. So the Titanic replied, "Keep out, old man," which meant, "Please be quiet, we're busy." And sadly, with that, the operator on the Californian went to bed.
Before the Californian could repeat its message or even give the MSG prefix, Titanic cut them off.
So the last chance to warn the Titanic of ice in the area was lost.
The Californian's radio operator had been about to deliver a warning. The iceberg risk was so bad, his ship had stopped her engines until sunrise. If the message had reached Captain Smith, he might have done the same.
This is one of the great what-ifs of the Titanic. And you could say it was a mistake, most definitely. When the radio operator on the Californian was told to shut up, he basically shut up. He was going to bed that night anyway. He just closed down, went to bed. 10 minutes later, that's how to get the iceberg.
Radio wasn't the only way of averting iceberg danger. 15 meters above Titanic's foredeck, a crow's nest perched on her forward mast. It was manned day and night by lookouts whose job was to spot for hazards up ahead.
Captain Smith and Titanic's officers knew jolly well they were going into an ice area and they would have to keep a very sharp lookout indeed. And the White Star Line was one of the only shipping companies that employed dedicated lookouts.
The lookouts on that night were Reginald Lee and Frederick Fleet. Between them, they had years of experience at spotting icebergs. But on the night of April the 14th, they lacked a critical piece of kit.
The best way of spotting an iceberg was basically using your natural eyesight as wide as possible on the horizon. When you saw something ahead, then you would identify it with the binoculars.
The binoculars for the crow's nest were stored in the second officer's cabin. But on this particular voyage, the lookouts couldn't get at them.
Nobody really knows what happened. The only thing we know for a fact is that before the Titanic left Southampton, there was a reordering of the officers. Henry Wilde came over from the Olympic with Captain Smith, and as a result, Second Officer David Blair left the Titanic.
When Blair left the ship, it's thought that he took the key to his cabin with him.
Because the second officer had been changed over before the sinking, they didn't actually have a key for the binoculars.
In ordinary conditions, the lack of binoculars might not have proven a problem. But on the night of the collision, things were far from ordinary.
The conditions the night the Titanic sank were truly extraordinary. It was one of the clearest nights in history. The pressure was very high, which meant that the air was crystal clear. In fact, the starlight was so bright the night the Titanic sank that one crew member said you could have played a game of football. This gave them confidence that they could go fast and still see the iceberg.
You think you're looking at a clear sea, but what you're actually looking at is a haze. There's kind of like an optical illusion happening, and it's masking things like icebergs from sight, so it really is a bit of a mind twist.
If you look at this glass of water here, as the pencil is behind it, what you can start to see is the different shapes that are being made. And that's simply because light is bending according to the density of the water behind it. And this was the same the night the Titanic sank, because the air was different densities, and therefore the light was bending. Everyone has heard of a desert mirage. Well, this actually created what we call a miraging haze at the horizon behind the iceberg. So in effect, the haze on the distant horizon actually camouflaged the iceberg in the near ground.
Lookouts Fred Fleet and Reginald Lee have no idea that they are staring into an optical illusion.
If they'd had binoculars, theoretically, they could have seen that base of the berg a little bit earlier, and those few seconds could have been crucial for Titanic.
In the inquiry that followed the disaster, Fleet was asked about the missing binoculars. His reply was telling.
I'd have seen the iceberg a bit sooner.
How much sooner?
Well enough to get out of the way.
By 11:30 p.m., Titanic was steaming into the ice field at a brisk 22 knots, armed only with the eyesight of her 2 lookouts. She was traveling at over 10 meters a second, covering her entire length in less than 30 seconds. Too fast to react to anything coming out of the haze. 11:39 p.m. On the bridge, First Officer Andrew Murdoch stands watch, while the captain gets some sleep in his cabin. 37 seconds before the Titanic strikes the iceberg, Frederick Fleet spots something in the way. The cry rings out, "Iceberg dead ahead!" Murdoch hears the bell ring 3 times. The signal for danger on the bow.
As soon as the 3 strikes of the bell were heard, Murdoch looked ahead to assess the situation. He could see a berg coming directly towards them, and he decided to turn.
He immediately had the helm put over first to the left and then to the right to try and skirt round the iceberg, and then that the engine should be stopped.
He shouted the order, and then it was confirmed that the wheel was swung hard over. At the same time, he rang full astern on the Titanic's engine telegraph.
On Murdoch's command, the great ship starts to swing round, but she cannot escape the iceberg's underwater shelf.
Whilst they've almost cleared the iceberg above the water, what they haven't done is clear the massive portion of it under the waterline, and what happens is the iceberg rakes the side of the Titanic under the waterline.
Naval architect Stephen Payne designed the Queen Mary II. He believes that the way Titanic's steering worked acted against her in those crucial few seconds.
In simple terms, a rudder deflects water. Simple, flat plate. And you twist it at the stern and it directs the water flow from one side to the other. But the efficiency of the Titanic's rudder was augmented by a central propeller, thrusting water past this flat plate.
Titanic's central propeller gives its rudder more power to change direction, but only when it's rotating.
Crucially, when the order was given to stop the engines and then latterly reverse them, the center propeller would have been stopped.
Cutting power to the central propeller would have stopped it pushing water across the rudder for a few crucial seconds.
We're talking about a marginal situation here. And perhaps the rudder working a few percentage points more efficiently may have swung round just a little bit more to actually miss the iceberg.
Instead, Titanic struck the giant berg. But the collision was so glancing that hardly anyone realized what had happened. The passengers were completely unaware that deep below decks, her fate was already sealed.
People were not prepared for what was going to happen. They certainly didn't realize that the ship was about to sink.
Contrary to popular belief, when the iceberg scraped along Titanic's starboard side, it probably didn't tear a hole through its steel hull. Instead, it exposed the 7th crucial error that helped doom the stricken ship. Titanic's hull was made up of hundreds of metal plates fixed together with an astonishing 3 million rivets, most of them made of steel.
A rivet is a way of fastening 2 sheets of metal together. You would take this rivet and heat it up and then put it in through a hole that was punched through the 2 pieces of metal that are lined up on top of each other. and the rivet is put in through that hole and then hammered at the flat end, and that deforms the flat end into another head and fastens these two pieces of metal together.
These rivets hold up well under normal circumstances, but the North Atlantic was unusually cold that night.
Because Titanic was cutting through smooth, icy waters, her hull would have actually been below freezing at the time of the collision.
A simple experiment called a Sharpie test demonstrates how different temperatures affect the strength of steel. This steel bar is similar to that used in the Titanic's rivets. At room temperature, the steel bar bends, but does not break. But when it's chilled in sub-zero water, the steel undergoes a fundamental change. The super-chilled steel has lost its ability to absorb the blow's energy. In the icy waters of the Atlantic, Titanic's rivets below the waterline would have become similarly brittle. But that's not all. High-quality steel rivets could only be inserted using a bulky hydraulic machine, which in the bow section was a challenge.
The hydraulic riveter was a very, very large, unwieldy piece of equipment. Where the hydraulic riveter was not so efficient was in the parts which are not straight, the turn of the bilge, or in the bow of the ship, where the hull is more angled. As a result, you had to use manual riveting crews there.
But steel rivets required too much force to be hammered in by hand. So the plates of the ship's bow section had to be fixed together by rivets made not of steel, but iron. And iron had significant drawbacks.
Wrought iron is not quite as versatile as steel, and when it's made in the smelting process, it produces a byproduct called slag, which is just all the stuff in the ore that you don't really want in your iron.
The slag in the rivets can make them even more prone to fracture when struck by a heavy force in low temperatures. And that's exactly what happens when a ship is struck by an iceberg.
You really have to appreciate the forces that were involved here. When you consider Titanic, 50,000 tons of weight, moving at 20 miles per hour, there's a lot of energy in that system. And to strike an iceberg, which to all intents and purposes is an immovable object, you've suddenly got all that energy striking a solid object.
As the iceberg hits the Titanic, that force and that impact has to be absorbed, it has to go somewhere, and it's going to impact the weakest sections of the ship that it's hitting, and those are along the seams, along the rivets. So the ship basically gets unzipped and water floods in, and we know what happens after that.
The brittle rivets snap, allowing the steel plates of the hull to open up in several places below the waterline. Using iron rivets had been a big mistake, but Titanic was supposed to survive damage on a massive scale.
Titanic had 15 bulkheads, dividing her into 16 compartments. If part of the hull was breached in any way, that the flooding would be contained.
In fact, Titanic was designed to take on water in up to 4 of her main compartments. And her forward bow section also had an extra watertight compartment that slowed the rise of water in her nose.
This made her effectively one of the safest ships afloat.
10 minutes after the collision, all seems calm. But down below in the boiler rooms, events were starting to spiral out of control. Ultimately, they would expose a fatal weakness in Titanic's supposedly unsinkable design.
Our man on the spot that night, in terms of the boiler room, is Fred Barrett, a fireman on the Titanic.
The iceberg has opened up a hole in Titanic's hull. The room he's in starts filling with water. Fred retreats into the next compartment.
As the watertight door closes behind him, Fred is safe in boiler room number 5.
Here, Fred is surprised to see water spurting into the empty coal bunker. He slams the bunker door shut. It's not watertight, but it'll have to do. For the next hour, he works to keep the ship afloat.
He's trying to oversee some kind of rescue attempt to pump water out and see if they can at least prolong the life of the ship.
Suddenly, a mass of green foamy water came crashing through into the boiler room, and Fred suddenly realised there was absolutely no more he could do. He ran to the nearest emergency ladder and got out.
Titanic had 16 watertight compartments formed by internal bulkheads designed to limit flooding. But water is now flooding more compartments than she was designed to handle.
At 12:40, water starts pouring into the ship, and the ship begins to sink more rapidly than before.
The compartment Fred escaped from housed the coal bunker where he and his men had spent days fighting a fierce fire. The extreme heat had warped the plates of the bunker's rear wall, which formed part of a crucial watertight bulkhead. Some water was entering the compartment through the hole in the hull, but was it also getting in from the next door compartment through the damaged bulkhead?
I think you have to concede that there may have been some damage done to the bulkhead by the bulkhead fire.
We know that one of the bulkheads was exposed to the fire that was in the coal bunker, and it is possible that that heat compromised steel and it could have cracked and allowed that water to flow through.
We know from the inquiry into the Titanic disaster that the fire-damaged plates in the bulkhead may have been weeping about 1 or 2 buckets of water per hour, even before the collision.
How much the fire-warped bulkhead contributed to the flooding is controversial. But it is clear that once the bunker filled with water, all that held it back was a flimsy door.
The compartment filled up with 10 feet of water, and the weight of the water in that compartment was about 440 tons, and there was 3 tons of weight on the door.
When the pressure on the door got to more than 3 tons, the door burst open, sending a huge wave, knocking him to the ground.
A whole load of water which had been held back for a while suddenly began to overwhelm the compartment.
The front 6 compartments of Titanic are now filling with water, pushing her lower and lower under the surface. Until now, Titanic had been flooding slowly, giving enough time to evacuate all the 2,200 plus people on board. But as she sank deeper into the water, a terrible mistake by some of the passengers in cabins towards the bows would hasten Titanic's demise. Despite the force of the collision, the total area left open to the sea by the 6 breaches in the hull was surprisingly small.
Now, in fact, when you put all these together, it makes an area just the size of, I don't know, a fireplace or something like that. So not a very big area at all. But what happened was, after the collision, the Titanic came to a stop, and people wondered what had happened. So their natural reaction was to open the portholes and have a look.
As the ship's fate became clear, the crew ordered passengers up on deck, ready for evacuation.
And then, when they went up to the lifeboats, they left the portholes open. As Titanic's passenger accommodation began to dip under the Atlantic, the open portholes meant that water flooded in at a much greater rate. In fact, 12 open portholes would have doubled the iceberg damage to Titanic. And of course, there were hundreds of portholes in Titanic's bow.
More than 300 of the ship's portholes opened onto passenger cabins. The all-too-human curiosity of passengers helped to accelerate the rate at which the ship would sink. And as she filled with water, it became clear that a fatal mistake had been made in the design of her watertight bulkheads. Standing an average of 12 meters high, the bulkheads weren't tall enough to reach the passenger deck level. A deliberate choice by Titanic's designers.
The designers of the ship wanted more space for the deck and more rooms for the passengers. So the bulkheads didn't go all the way up to the top of the ship.
The problem is that you have a hotel. The whole reason the ship is there is for the easy movement of passengers in their cabins, through the public spaces.
Now, the consequence of that decision would come back to haunt them. Once the water reaches the top of the bulkheads, they become useless. Water spills over them, flooding all the compartments, and rampages unchecked through the public spaces above. It's the final straw. Titanic's bows dip below the surface, hoisting her stern high in the air.
In the final moments, there were thunderous crashes as the steel was heard down below to be breaking apart at the keel level. And then higher up, there was almost a stampede of passengers towards the stern of the ship.
She rises so high in the water and then she seems to right herself again and people think they're saved. Everything might be all right briefly, but all that is the stern snapping off and falling back down. You have all-out chaos and the final death throes.
The lights went out, and then the ship bobbed for a bit, and then disappeared forever.
At 2:20 a.m. on Monday the 15th of April, Titanic finally sank into the frozen depths of the Atlantic Ocean, dragging around 1,500 of her passengers and crew down with her. After hitting the iceberg, she had managed to stay afloat for 2 hours and 40 minutes.
I think it was remarkable just how well the ship did, considering 1/3 of the ship had been fatally compromised.
But all that loss of life need not have happened were it not for one crucial error: Titanic's final mistake. If First Officer Murdoch had not tried to miss the iceberg, she might have survived the collision.
If the Titanic had struck the iceberg head-on, about 100 feet, 1/8 of the length of the ship would have been crushed, but the watertight bulkheads would have held. The likelihood is that that damage would not have been fatal, and the ship would have remained afloat.
The Titanic's foremost bow section was a collision bulkhead. Like the crumple zone in a modern car, it was designed to absorb the worst of a head-on impact, protecting the integrity of the compartments behind and reducing the inflow of water. But by swinging the ship around in a bid to avoid the iceberg, Murdoch sideswiped it instead.
Titanic heeled over and left the coffin-shaped flat bottom, presented it to the shelf of the berg. So a lot more underwater damage was because she was what's called on the swing.
Scraping the underside of the ship along the iceberg arguably caused more structural damage than a head-on crash. But Murdoch could never have made that call.
If you are First Officer Murdoch, the last thing that's going to occur to you to do is to smash face first into an iceberg. It just doesn't happen. It's against every human instinct. Also, as well, it's a brand new, shiny ship, and it's a career ender if you make the wrong call.
In my opinion, you couldn't fault Murdoch in what he did. It was the classic response and what was expected of him.
More than 100 years later, the legacy of the Titanic dead lives on.
We owe them a tremendous debt and gratitude because Sailing today on a modern ship is so much safer because of the lessons learned from the Titanic.
As a result of the Titanic, we have lifeboats for everybody, we have greater watertight integrity in ships, we have greater safety regulations, although health and safety can drive you nuts.
As the designer of the Queen Mary 2, the last transatlantic liner operating on the Atlantic, I had to be acutely aware of all the lessons learnt from the Titanic. And in fact, the majority of those lessons are now enshrined in maritime law.
They have a saying that safety rules are written in blood. Well, in the Titanic's case, that couldn't be more true.